Okay. Good morning. So, as Steve kind of mentioned, I'm everything except what I really do. I'm a diabetes psychologist. It's all I've done for 30 plus years now. I am, as he mentioned, like many of you, one of the losers, because I don't have type 1, so excuse me ahead of time. The other name that Steve typically refers to me as is the touchy-feely guy, and I now can enjoy that with pride. Anyway, I got limited time here, so you can see the title, Taking Control Together. There's a bunch of things I want to make sure that we cover in the next half an hour, and hopefully it's going to help you warm up, because it's kind of cold in this room. So, what are you going to get out of being here anyway? Many of you were here last year, but I want to take a few minutes to think about what are you going to get out of being here at the One Conference? And I want to suggest to you from our experience last year, what I even saw last night, I had a chance to talk with many of you, there's really 3 buckets of stuff I think everyone is going to get. I'm not sure which is going to be best for each of you, but here's what those buckets are. The first one is, you're all going to hear about, if you don't already know, some super cool new tools. And this means medications, devices, software, new adhesives. I mean, all the things that are really important. And one of the things, the dramatic changes, as you may know, that we've seen in type 1 diabetes over just the past few years, is all of these tools are designed to help people manage type 1 diabetes more effectively and not feel so boxed in by diabetes. We've now done, part of my job is not just seeing folks with diabetes, we do a lot of research as well, is to really document the degree to which so many of the cool new tools we have are really having a major positive impact on helping people to live freer lives, to be less burdened by this disease, and to just have a better quality of life. So that's one huge thing. I'm not going to even talk about those cool new tools. That's what you're going to hear about the rest of today and tomorrow. The other thing I think it's really important that I expect everyone here to leave with is not just more information about tools and software and everything else, but there's some really important facts that are kind of woven in with everything you're going to hear about from the speakers, that you're going to hear about from each other. And these are themes that we've heard before. There's themes that I like to talk about. I think they're so important, so I want to highlight on just a few of them. So there's so many important, simple facts. Many of these are facts just simply that I'm hoping you'll leave here and going, well, I knew that, but it's nice to be reminded about. There's many of them, but I want to highlight just 3 of them. So here's what the 3 are. And the first one is going to, I know, shock many of you. Are you ready? Okay, here it is. At least on occasion, living with type 1 diabetes really sucks. Okay? So I'm glad you're all sitting down and want to surprise too many of you. Okay? That doesn't mean it sucks all the time, and there's actually some of you are going to go, what are you talking about? It's never a problem for me at all. Fine. But for most people, trust me, we've actually even done the research on this. I can assure you of this. For the vast majority of people, they go through times where there's at least one thing about diabetes that's driving them crazy. Okay? That's normal. That's common. So if you've ever gone through times in your life or going through times now where you're feeling overwhelmed, discouraged, frightened, depressed, etc., it means you're normal. It's the vast majority of people with type 1 diabetes in this country and in this world. And we understand a lot about that. We know that the day you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, the universe gave you a new job to do. Congratulations. You get to do this for the rest of your life. Oh, I forgot to tell you there's no vacations and no pay, but enjoy it. I hope you have a good time. And it really, as I don't have to tell you this, but I'm going to highlight it for you, it is a lot of work. It is a balancing act, right? And it's a balancing act that requires a significant amount of vigilance and effort every day, right? And by the way, in all the work we do, I can tell you that the number one complaint, the most common complaint you ever hear from anybody with type 1 diabetes in this world is what we call the 24/7 problem. I never get a break. I never get a break. And a lot of the work we're doing, everything we do now, is to help figure out how we can help people have a break. And that's where a lot of our new tools are coming in. But we know if you have a job that takes this much effort, and it can also be so aggravating and frustrating, it's very easy to get pretty fatigued by it, right? It can beat you down. Now, that doesn't mean, as you all know, type 1 diabetes is still relatively manageable, but most people with type 1, many of you here who are like me don't have type 1, may not actually understand that so well. This is a job, right? And it's a job that's doable, but you have to do this job on top of all the other responsibilities and pressures and things that are demanding your attention every single day. So let's just acknowledge that. And I expect and hope you're going to hear a lot about that from each other as well. It doesn't mean it isn't solvable, but let's just acknowledge that's real life, and that's the truth. So that's fact number one. Fact number two, which also I bet is going to be rather obvious, is that, you know what? Hypoglycemia can be a little scary. And I talked to several people last night, actually, who've had very severe and frightening episodes of hypoglycemia. It's, by the way, our recent research shows us, it's actually even scarier for partners and spouses and parents than it is for folks with type 1. And we know there's actually what's called hypoglycemia-related insomnia in partners, right? All of you, not everyone here has a CGM, but those of you with CGMs know this remarkably odd phenomena that no one's ever figured out, which is when your CGM alarm goes off late at night, who does it wake up? Isn't that a bit strange that everyone seems to know about that, right? Doesn't seem to bother the person with diabetes, but that partner, damn, will you do something about that? Jeez, come on already. So we know this is a very important fact. It's related, again, to a lot of the new things you'll be hearing about today. If you haven't already, it's something you'll learn more about from each other as we think about solutions as well, and there's many of those. So that's fact number two. Fact number three, again, a theme that I think is so important that you'll hear about throughout today and doesn't get talked about enough. And I think it's the most important thing. I've talked a lot about it at the TCOIDs we do all over the country, is something really critical, and it's this. You know what? Things are getting better. Things are getting a lot better. And let me just highlight that. And what I mean by that is if you're living with type 1 diabetes, you can expect something very different. You know, when I first started working at the Joslin Diabetes Center in 1988, I remember one of the first people I ever met, a guy walked into my room and he says, I have a big problem, I hope you can help me. I said, sure, what is it? And he says, I've had type 1 diabetes for 22 years, and today, he said, is my 30th birthday. And I said, wow, that sounds like a pretty serious problem. Happy birthday. And he goes, no, you don't understand. I was told that I was going to live to the age of 30, maybe, but that's it. And now I'm 30, and I'm kind of doing okay. So now what do I do with my life? And we know the terrible messages so many people got, but we know that things have changed. So just to highlight that, and again, I apologize for those who may have heard some of this before, but we know there are lots and lots of people living with long lives with diabetes. We know there's more and more what we call 50-year medalists. Joslin Diabetes Center gives out medals to people living with diabetes for 50 years. So does Lilly. I know there's a lot of people here. How many people had diabetes for type 1 for over 50 years here? I mean, look at this. Yeah. So, and by the way, so this is from one of the times they try to bring many of the folks together at the Joslin who've had a medal for lived with type 1 for 50 years. And by the way, if you have it for 50 years and you've never had a medal, you don't have to be a patient of the Joslin Diabetes Center. Call them up Monday morning and say, where's my damn medal, right? I mean, it's this big, honking, heavy medal. It's very impressive. You get a little certificate. It's pretty cool. But oftentimes, they bring people together, and it's really wonderful. About a third of these people have, by the way, no complications from diabetes whatsoever. I shouldn't take time to tell you this. I'll tell you one story. So often they used to do banquets for these folks, and I was at one of the banquets at the Joslin, and I was sitting next to this lady, and it turns out she was the spouse, the wife of one of the guys who was getting his 50-year medal. And they'd been married 40-some years. And she said, oh, what's your job? And I said, well, I'm the psychologist here at the Joslin. And she grabbed me and she goes, oh my God, we have to talk right now. And I went, yeah, what's going on? She goes, I think I'm either going to kill him or kill myself. I can't believe you're a psychologist. We have to talk. And I go, well, what's the problem? She goes, I can sum it up in two words. You know, I've been married to this guy for 40 years. Here's my 2 words. Are you ready? Baked chicken. And her husband was actually one of the original patients of Elliot Joslin, the guy who founded the Joslin Diabetes Center. And she went on, she goes, you know, every night, that's all he wants, that's all he'll eat, 7 days a week. Baked chicken. My head's going to explode. And of course, that night at the banquet, poor lady. I hope she survived. Anyway, so we know there's lots of people. Every year there's a new crop of Jocelyn medalists, by the way. They started back in 1984 giving out the Jocelyn Medal. And I managed to occasionally track them down and say, how many medals did you give out this year? So starting on the left side of the screen, that's 1984 all the way through 2017, the last year. Things go up, things go down. But this is not cumulative. This is the number of medal winners every year. But there's more and more people, if you will, living long lives with diabetes. Type 1 diabetes. There's a lot more people living long lives with type 1 diabetes. This is really good news. We also know what that means in terms of risk of complications. And I want to show you my two favorite slides, and then we're going to do a little activity together, by the way, so get prepared. So what happens if you've had diabetes, type 1 diabetes, for 30 years? What's your risk? How many people with type 1 diabetes that are living with this disease for 30 years run into the really, really scary complications? So sometimes big healthcare systems that do a pretty good job of taking good care of their patients actually put their data together. So I have to show you just two data slides. And so here's data from one of the best diabetes care centers in the world. And they said, we looked at our big population of people with type 1 who had type 1 for 30 years. And here's how the percentage of them had run into long-term complications. Hard to read, but on the left side of the screen, they found that about 30% of their patients already had severe vision loss, more than 10% had significant amputations, and well more than a third, almost 40%, already had significant kidney disease or nephropathy. This is really startling. Now that sounds terrible and sounds kind of discouraging. That's a lot of people until, in fact, some of you may already have noticed, that's funny, why in the middle of that screen does it say 1978? Oh yeah, this is really, really, really old data, okay? This is from the Steno Diabetes Center in Copenhagen. Well, that's nice. So these are people, of course, who've never, ever heard of anything called an A1C test, a blood glucose monitor, analog insulin, nothing, right? Nothing. What about nowadays? What if you had a big population of folks who had type 1 diabetes? They've had it for 30 years, but we looked at them recently, in the past few years, as opposed to way back in 1978. Things have changed, haven't they? So if we look at what's called the long-term Edik trial, these are 711 people who have had pretty good, decent care of their diabetes, their type 1 diabetes, at least back when it was called the DCCT. They managed to have an average mean A1C of about 7.1% for 4 years. Once the study was over, they went, oh, thank God, and their A1C floated up to about 8%, where it's been since then. So how are those guys doing nowadays? What do their numbers look like? What percentage of them have run into the same kind of scary complications? Well, their numbers look like this. So again, 1% severe vision loss. Nobody has gone blind. 1% amputation. Some of you are actually probably in the Edik trial because there are folks all over the United States. Kidney disease still happens, but again, the numbers are unbelievably smaller. And this is 2009. Things are getting way better. Now, there's all sorts of reasons we have to be careful about how we talk about these data. There's no guarantees. Terrible things happen. People still run into scary complications. It still happens. It's awful. But the trend is amazing. So I want everyone to understand, if you really look at all the evidence that's been collected over the past few years and we think about what's happening, everyone should be incredibly optimistic. And what it really means, and we know this for a fact, is with good care and effort, odds are pretty good you can live a long and healthy life with diabetes. The brand new evidence from this data suggests now that people who have adequate glycemic control and have type 1 may be living longer than people who don't have diabetes. Okay, so things are really changing. So enough of these facts. So we know there's super cool new tools you're going to be hearing about. We know there's really important facts, and we could go all day, but there's actually a third important thing that everybody here at One is going to get out of being here that's even more important than these two things. Anybody want to guess what it is? Yeah, of course. It's good old camaraderie. Now, I bring up this word camaraderie, and I can already see my friend Dr. Edelman probably ready to Google, oh, gee, I wonder what that word means. So let's define it for him, just in case it isn't really clear. It is, in fact, the warm feelings of friendship, closeness, and loyalty shared among a group of people. I can show you the Urban Dictionary version later. You're not going to like that one. But it is your opportunity to meet each other. I'm a little late to the game. Jeremy started talking about this last night. This is already happening, right? I could see it happening last night. I saw it at breakfast this morning. It's an opportunity to learn from each other. If there's one thing we know about living with type 1 diabetes, is that the vast majority of people almost never get a chance to meet anybody else with type 1, anybody else who really gets it, right? This is an old patient of mine who drew me a picture. She was a lady in her early 30s with type 1 since she was a kid. I asked her to draw me a picture of what living with diabetes is like. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this is that this lady is never going to win any major art awards, okay? But I said, well, what is this picture? And she said, well, that's me over on the left, and this is my husband and my 2 kids over on the right, and they're very close. She goes, I love them, and they love me. You can see they're smiling and holding hands. I got a little frown on my face over there on the left, and between us is this diabetes wall that they want to understand, but they just don't really get it. They don't get my concerns, what I'm going through, how much effort this is, etc. There's something that they just don't get. We know if you have type 1, it's easy to feel incredibly isolated. And so how do we think about dealing with this isolation? Now, as we think about it, I want to just throw in a caveat here that we know that men and women are very different when we think about relationships, right? So here's some very fancy research to clarify that. So as we know, if you look at what are women on the left thinking about most of the time, it's they're tormented about their relationships, right? Is this okay? Is this good? They have to talk to each other about it. And they spend a lot less time thinking about other things like things they shouldn't have eaten, having to pee, men trashing, etc. But over there on the right, you know, I'm sorry guys, but we don't really think about our relationships much. We got other fish to fry, right? We got sports and sex and our career and worried about going bald and why we're getting these strange ear and nose hair growths, and it's a different world. So granted, we are different. But the idea of camaraderie, of how we have connections with each other, and that doesn't have to be just here, right? So we know oftentimes camaraderie is from, you know, people we meet at work, for example. We know it can be, if it's not work colleagues, it can be actually your family, right? It can also be just people who live around you. We might call them old friends, for example. So, but when we think about how do we encourage camaraderie here, I got to be clear about this, because you may have already noticed this. Let's be fair. We have a lot of really different people here, right? So many different folks here, different kinds of folks. Many of you have type 1. If you don't have type 1, you're here because you care about somebody who has type 1. But what kind of folks are here? Well, first of all, many of you are what we would call T1D techies, right? So you really already know a ton about diabetes. You know what CGM stands for. You might be worried about what's the best kind of adhesive, or you're worried about fine-tuning stuff. But to some degree, you've kind of got this down to some degree, and you're looking for some extra little bit. But there are also a lot of people who aren't techies at all. They're just really confused, like, what the heck is going on? You might be new to diabetes, maybe not. Nothing you're doing is working. But it's really easy just to feel, let's face it, to be confused about your own type 1 diabetes. And there's things you really want to know. We also know there are people here who have been hit hard by complications, right? And we know if you've been hit hard, especially here, it's easy to feel guilty about it. Like, oh, somehow it's my fault. If only I'd done a better job. That's not fair. There's all sorts of other genetic reasons that contribute to risk for complications that we still are learning about. We know there's people who had no complications whatsoever. We know there's also people who have type 1 diabetes who are concerned about pregnancy. And by the way, there's a specific term for those people. We call them females. Okay? We know there's folks who are hopeful and confident, right? That you understand and know that with good care, odds are good, we live a long and healthy life with diabetes. But there's also many of you here who aren't so sure about that. And you're scared and worried about the future. There's many of you who really have your diabetes act together. Congratulations. But there's a lot of people who definitely don't. And I was thinking about that last year. I think that people who don't have their act together have a lot of concerns and questions. You end up being a little too quiet. You know, we let the techies talk too much. And it's like, there's people here going, well, what are you talking about? Or how do I really do that? So I hope you guys will speak up. We know there's people who really feel isolated and alone. And that's why being here is so valuable and so important. And we also know that some of you here who have plenty of great support from loved ones. There's more. We know there's people who feel overwhelmed and burned out and frequently stressed out by diabetes. That's actually why I have a job, by the way. We also know there's people who are terrified about hypoglycemia, who've really been traumatized, and that can include partners as well. There are many folks here, I think, who are way too unreasonably nonchalant about hypos. Maybe you've had a lot and you're not worried about it, even though your family members are. It's a big issue that we face. We know there's many of you here are concerned about erection problems. We have a special term for you. Those are called males, by the way. We know there's folks here who really profoundly hate their type 1 diabetes. We know there's people who are really at peace with this disease. We know there's a lot of you here, talked about the legends last night, who are really newly diagnosed, to fit in that first category. How many of you here have had type 1 diabetes for less than 1 year? Yeah, all right. Cool. Really glad you're here. We also know there are a lot of you old timers. I've already found out how many of you are have had it for 50 years. We know there's a lot of really, really nice people here. But to be fair, there's a few perhaps not so pleasant people. And by the way, they don't mean to be unpleasant. They may not even realize how unpleasant they really are. But again, we're all in the same boat here. There's many folks with type 1 who either before or now often are struggling around food, struggling around insulin, maybe even cutting back on their insulin to watch their weight. It's a shameful thing that unfortunately way, way, way too many folks, especially young women, go through. It's tough, and it's a tough one to get over. We know there's so many of you here who've actually going, what are you talking about? They really never struggled with their diabetes in any way. There's many of you who are really involved in the DOC. But we also know there's a lot of you who have no idea what DOC stands for. And by the way, DOC stands for Diabetes Online Community. And I do not want to neglect my fellow losers. There are many of you here who are partners and spouses and friends and family, and you're here because you care. And what you all have in common is that there's at least one thing about diabetes that's driving you crazy, that there's at least one fairly positive experience you've had with type 1 diabetes over the years, and it's really, really nice to meet other people who get it, right? It's really, really nice for all sorts of reasons. Number one, misery likes company. We also know being here and being able to meet your colleagues and friends and new friends, it's a way to get perspective, right? It's a way to look at something that might be burdening you and dragging you down and helping you to get some new way of thinking about it, to find a way to laugh together about diabetes. And that means laughing together about diabetes, not laughing at each other about diabetes. So what? So I only have a few minutes left. So here's the important thing. What you've already started to do, but I want to do right now, is it's really time to do a little exercise where you get a chance to meet someone you haven't met before. It's time to meet your colleagues. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. In a moment, not yet, I'm going to ask you to stand up. I'm going to get a chance to pick someone you don't know here and to address one of the following 4 questions to talk about with your colleague. Here's what they are. What was being diagnosed like for you? What's one thing about type 1 that drives you nuts? What's living with type 1 like for you? Or my favorite, is that Dr. Polonsky one awesome dude or what? Okay. Now, when you're just taking these few moments to talk with each other, remember you're being good listeners. And what you don't want to be is to be a good advice giver. It's hysterically funny, and we do a lot of structured group programs for folks with type 1 diabetes, and they will say, what really bothers me more than anything? It's when people act like the diabetes police. I just really hate it when people nag me and tell me what to do and give me advice I didn't ask for, and then you put them in these situations, and they're just as annoying to everybody else. So you don't want to be a diabetes policeman. If you're not familiar with the concept of the diabetes police, these are usually loved ones, people care about you, but they're providing a little too much support, right? Honey, you shouldn't be eating that. You seem a little upset. Maybe you should check your blood sugar. And we have formal ways of dealing with that. If you go to our website, it's Behavioral Diabetes, you'll see there's a little card many of you have called the Diabetes Etiquette card. And the number one, you can't read this, but the number one issue on the Diabetes Etiquette card, this is for people who don't have diabetes, is don't offer unsolicited advice about my eating or any other aspect of my diabetes. Actually, number 3 is my favorite, which is don't tell me horror stories about your grandmother. All right, I want everybody just to stand up just for a moment, if you would. And I want you to look around the room. We're going to take 2 minutes here and find someone you don't know. Find someone you don't know. Say hello and talk to them for 2 minutes. And the most important thing is to take the time to meet some new folks. And remember, there's no judgment, there's no advice unless it's requested, and we're all in this together. And you'd also want to remember, at least for this weekend, you don't have to do diabetes alone. And I think Jeremy said this so well last night, look to your left, look to your right if you need anything. You don't have to do diabetes alone. I think that's really incredibly important. Now, one last thing I want to mention. For those of you who are spouses or partners, we're gearing up to do a little study. So I have one favor to ask you. This is my institute, the Behavioral Diabetes Institute. We're trying to understand about how spouses and partners think about hypos. We're going to be doing a little online survey, hopefully in the next few months. We're paying you for your time. It's anonymous. All we need is your email address. So I just made a bunch of copies of a little form that just has your email address. And I left it with our friends at the Xeris booth over in the sponsors lounge. So at our break, if you'd be willing just to give us your email address, I promise no one's going to use it except me and the Behavioral Diabetes Institute. And we're just giving us permission to contact you when we're ready to do the survey. And at that point, you can say yes or no or anything. But if you'd just be willing to do that, it'd be really helpful for us. All right, you guys look really tired and sick of me. So I'm going to turn things back over to Jeremy. Thank you all for listening. I'm doing a workshop later, so I'll see many of you later. Thanks.